Mateer. I am hosting our next presentation here in the Melkweg for the Brainwash Festival. School of Life is from Meg Mateer. Is being presented The Wisdom in Our Distress. And just to tell you a little bit about Meg, she has been working 15 years within the field of organizational psychology. She's originally from Philly and has been living in the Netherlands for 4 years. She's the host of the Breakdown Wakeup podcast. Philadelphia, for those who don't know Philly. That's good. I'm American, I just immediately Philly. She is a teacher at the School of Life and also works as a social impact consultant with organizations. And you will see that this presentation also has a very personal tilt to it as well for her. And so this talk that we are here for, the wisdom in our distress, we asked the question, do you sometimes hide your emotions and fears? What if these feelings are a wake-up call for positive change? Organizational psychologist Meg Mateer talks about leaders who have embraced emotions such as panic, sorrow, and despair, sound familiar, to make positive changes in their lives. And according to Meg, embracing these emotions is a key to solving the biggest social challenge. So without further ado, Meg Mateer.
Hello. Oh, it's so nice to see all these amazing faces. Thanks, Norman, for the intro. Norman and I are American buddies now, becoming very close friends very fast. So I thought at this Brainwash Festival that I could give a confession. I have a confession to make. I'm kind of into cults. Anybody else? There's always a few of us. And my boyfriend got me a book a couple weeks ago about cults and how they're kind of pervasive in society. You didn't know that? But so I started diving back into the whole cult documentary series. And for those of you who are not familiar, what usually happens in these cult docuseries is the first few episodes are like, beautiful, everything's great, it's a beautiful, little community, society, and the people that are in the cults are really enthusiastic about them. But then, and this is my favorite part, then at some point, one of the characters starts to think like, something is not quite right here. Maybe this whole thing, these beliefs, these values, these ideas that I've been brainwashed with in this cult, maybe they're not so true. But what happens with these characters is that they're in the middle of this inner tension, this like inner conflict. On the one side, they're like, am I actually picking up on the fact that I'm in a cult? Or am I crazy? And usually at that point, when I see this inner struggle, I'm on the other side of the television saying, you're not crazy, you're in a cult, believe yourself. Anyways, the reason why I'm obsessed with cults, and maybe reason why I'm particularly interested in this point, is because I can relate to that. I can relate to that inner struggle of those moments where you start to think, there's something waking up within me that, I want to believe, I want to listen to my gut, but on the other hand, I'm getting something else. I'm getting other messages. And that, one of the first times that happened to me in my life was when I was 15. I was a teenager. I was going through a really tough period of time. It was 3 months feeling really tired. I had a lot of social anxiety. I was crying every day. I was really confused about what was going on for me. So, of course, I went to the experts. I said, I'm going to go to my doctor. What's happening here? And my doctor sat me down and she said, Meg, you have a diagnosis of clinical depression. And then she said, don't worry, it's not your fault. It's just a chemical imbalance in your brain. You just don't have as much serotonin as the other people, and eventually we'll do brain scans and we'll be able to figure out that this is just a chemical thing. And don't worry, because we have medication for that. We can simply solve your distress and your suffering, and you can go on your merry way with a simple pill. And my first thought when I heard this was, sounds like a pretty good deal. But there was something in me, in my gut, that was saying, no, this doesn't make sense. My gut was saying that there was actually some wisdom and meaning in that period that I was going through, that struggle that I was in. That there was something to this, something for me to investigate. And that gut feeling kept sticking with me. The problem is that in the beginning, the first few years, I decided I'm not really gonna go there. I didn't want to go into my distress. Can anyone relate to that? Like you're in the midst of a struggling time and you're like, ooh, I don't want to listen to those fears or my sadness or anything. If you can relate to that, it's not unusual. Oftentimes our distress is portrayed as pathological, as if it's a problem with us or some diagnosis that we have. In addition to my own experience of being not diagnosed with depression, even centuries ago, we were pathologizing our distress feelings. So, anybody heard of hysteria? Yeah, hysteria, for those of you who are not familiar, is the fact that we diagnosed women, it was primarily with women, any of our emotional or physical health problems were diagnosed as hysteria, which was caused by the uterus wandering around in the body. So why investigate our distress? It's just our uterus, right? We were also taught that our distress is weakness. I certainly remember feeling like maybe I can't really cope with life as well as other people can. In addition, our distress is portrayed sometimes as illogical, especially our emotions. So this idea that listening to our distress in a world where we focus a lot on logic and facts and language might not be a good spot to go into that, what's illogical in our emotions, right? In addition, I learned that my distress was unproductive, right? It takes a long time, don't want to go in there. And to be honest, it's kind of painful, right? If we open our Pandora's box, if I was actually going to listen to what was going on in my depression, maybe I would discover things I really didn't want to know about myself. So for a while I thought, I'm not going to go in there. But the thing is that my distress kept knocking at the door. It kept saying, like, there is something in here. And even after I felt better, even after I got over my depression and felt better, came back into the world, I still had this nagging feeling of like, there's wisdom in here. But for a while, for about 15 years, I didn't listen to that wisdom. But then I started thinking, okay, if I'm gonna figure out what's going on for me, and if there is really wisdom in my distress, I've gotta find some allies. I thought, am I the only person here that feels this way, or are there others that also start to feel like there's a bit of wisdom in their distress? And what I started to do was, I thought, well, what better to figure out whether I have allies than to have conversations with people. So about 2 years ago, I started a podcast called Breakdown, Wake Up. I already kind of doubled down with the title of the podcast, that the message was there is wisdom in our distress. That was my hypothesis. And the concept was simple. I asked people that I admired, people that I thought were successful business people or interesting thinkers. I asked them 3 simple questions. Did you have an experience of distress in your life? Did you get any wisdom? Were there any learnings from that experience? And the third, would you be willing to share that story with me on a podcast? And surprisingly enough, most people that I asked, both people that I knew and also people that I didn't know, said, yes, I'm ready to share my story. And the red thread that I noticed within all of these stories was that there was something underneath the distress. So a lot of times, and this is also what happened with my doctor, we were focusing on what was going on above the iceberg. This is the classic iceberg model. If anyone studied psychology or anything, this is like the first thing they teach you. But there's a focus, my doctor was focusing on, and oftentimes we focus on this surface, what's above the waterline. And that clues us into, for example, that I was crying every day, my symptoms, how I was feeling at the time. But if we focus only on what's going on up above the waterline and try and get rid of that, what happens is that we might be missing signals. That our distress could be something that signals something deeper. There's where the wisdom lies, underneath the surface. So I'd like to share a few of those discovery stories from my allies that I found along the way. The first is a story about listening to your inner critic. Now, I'm curious, for those of you who also attended Thijs's talk earlier today about je bent genoeg. We talked a little bit about self-trust and listening, also accepting the parts of ourselves that maybe aren't so shiny and beautiful. But I wanted to hear from you guys, who can recognize their inner critic? Who has an inner critic? Okay, phew, good, all right. I'm not the only one, no. But, and maybe for a few of you guys, when you think about what is the topic of the day for your inner critic right now? What's the news headline? I know mine today was don't go to Brainwash. Everyone's gonna embarrass you. You're gonna get laughed at. So just stay home. Maybe you can pretend to have COVID or something like that. So, what are some topics? You could just shout it out.
You don't do enough.
You don't do enough. Yeah, that's a good one. The inner critic loves that one. Yeah. What else?
You should have slept earlier yesterday.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, especially on the weekends. And it's Halloween weekend too. So.
Too much
What?
caffeine.
Too much caffeine.
I'm still gonna take more.
Okay. I'm taking too much caffeine. Okay. What else? Couple more.
Too much candy.
Too much candy. All right. Not enough caffeine. Maybe too much. Yeah, so the inner critic has lots of opinions about us. And I spoke to a woman on the podcast about a story she had with her inner critic. This is Nadia Taranchevsky. And she is a coach and a speaker, and she also works with organizations. Really brilliant woman. I highly recommend listening to this episode. She told a story about her inner critic. She was moving on in her life, and she fell in love, and she was ready to jump full in to this new love of her life. But she had something that was holding her back. She felt there was a voice in her that said no, this isn't right. And she was really curious to understand this voice. And most of the times we say, we ignore our inner critic. But Nadia said, I'm going to actually have a conversation with my inner critic and see what's going on here. And when she talked to the inner critic that was keeping her from diving into this relationship, what she heard the inner critic say was, well, Nadia, you've fallen in love with a woman. And that's not okay. I mean, you always were attracted to men, and so why don't you just stay the course and be with a guy? And this surprised Nadia so much because in her conscious mind, she was someone who was very accepting to all sides of sexuality. But then she discovered this voice, and she was like, where is this voice coming from? And she realized that the voice sounded a lot like her grandmother. And she discovered that this inner critic was representing the values of her older conservative grandmother, who lived in a time where it wasn't quite safe to be more open about her sexuality. And so when she discovered this, she thought to herself, okay, I can choose to continue to believe this inner critic, or I can let it go. And when she was able to let that belief go, that by the way wasn't hers, it was from her grandma's, she was able to more fully move into this relationship. So the lesson from Nadia is really the curiosity to listen to your inner critic. It might seem scary, but what happens is our inner critic gives us rules, right? Like you're drinking too much caffeine, or you're not doing enough. That's also a big rule. But we can actually talk to that inner critic and understand, where are those rules coming from, and do I really want to accept them? Oftentimes these rules are things that we've gotten from our family system or society, and they just don't work for us. Similarly, on this note, so Gabor Mate says that whenever there's tension, it needs attention. So we go beyond the inner critic and we say, if there's, for example, if you've ever had this experience of wanting to do something, but on the other hand being held back, if you have like an inner conflict or an inner tension, it's something that needs attention. And Gabor Mate, I would say, he also knows what he's talking about. He's really amazing author and doctor who's done a lot of research in this field. And he's also worked with vulnerable populations. So he's worked in the addiction space as a doctor, and really curious about, again, what's underneath the symptom. So he says, when something feels tense, let's figure out what's going on there. Yes, the second and similar message is about listening to our addictions. Sounds a little counterintuitive, right? Like having too much coffee, too much candy. Should we be listening to this? We should just fix those behaviors, right? No. Well, in this story, actually, Daniel Pearson, he's, I would say, a successful business partner at Ernst & Young, which was a consulting company I used to work at. And Daniel says that he actually, in the midst of his recovery from addiction, he started to listen to his addiction. So Daniel, when he was in his late 20s, he had this breakdown moment that pulled him out of work, and he really needed to focus on his recovery in his addiction. And he asked, what is underneath the surface related to this addiction? And what he found out, after a lot of different sessions and connecting with himself and with a therapist, is that early on in his life, Daniel was a really sensitive and empathetic kid. And he was living in a family system where there was a lot of shame and a lot of secrecy. There was a situation in his family that everyone was really embarrassed by and nobody wanted to talk about. So Daniel, as a young child, absorbed all of this shame and this secrecy, and he didn't know where to put it. He just said, in his own words, he soaked it up like a sponge. And he kept it inside for so long. And he said, you know what, Meg? My addiction, which started when he was a teenager, my addiction was the one thing that I could do to take care of those emotions that I didn't know what to do with, to take care of the shame that I didn't know that I had to keep in, that I had to keep secret. So Daniel, once he started to make this connection, he started to see, wow, okay, there's a different way. My ultimate need, that I can serve that need. Initially it was through the addiction, but he can serve this need to not keep secrets and to manage his emotions by connecting with others. And he ended up starting to tell more of his story, and actually tells the story of what's going on in his family. I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for you guys in the podcast. So he's super open about what's going on. And it's just really powerful to, hear him connecting with his distress and realizing that going underneath and understanding what that meaning is underneath gave him the keys not only to understand himself better, but also to get relief from this addiction. Because if he was serving the need, that sensitive child, that he was taking care of the sensitive, empathetic child, he no longer needed the substances so much. So that's something to think about. And when I say addiction, we don't have to think about like the really, also like in very extreme terms. I think many of us can relate to having some sort of addictions, especially in this media-centric world where we have all sorts of stimuli and things that are designed to make us addicted. So yeah, so that's the lesson from Daniel. And what you can take for yourself is, if you're starting to behave in a certain way, or you feel like, oh, I have this compulsive need to smoke, go on Instagram, what else? Alcohol, work,
Binging.
also a good addiction. Work is very much a condoned addiction in our society. Food, yeah. Distraction, gaming, yeah. So if you have that impulse, it's not the idea that you need to like psychoanalyze yourself like in the first moment that you want to play a video game, but you can ask yourself, what's the need under this compulsive desire to grab something? And once you understand the need, you can find creative ways to support that need. The third story, to echo on this, there's a big speaker, very much related to Brainwash, Bessel van der Kolk, who says, as long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. That takes an enormous amount of courage. So Bessel van der Kolk is, he also knows what he's talking about. He's the author of The Body Keeps the Score, and talks about what happens to our bodies, both our physical and mental health, when we start to, instead of processing our emotions, when we hold things in, right? So Bessel and Daniel and I highly recommend getting those secrets out, because what I've noticed also in my work as a coach and as a facilitator is that we have so much in common with each other that we actually don't realize. It's like we're all in this audience, we all have this secret, and we're like, oh, I'm the only one. I can relate to that. I felt like I was the only one that had depression when I got diagnosed with depression. But we share so much together. So keep that in mind, and please also, as like a tip from the youth, as we say in Dutch, maybe have a conversation with someone after about something that is vulnerable, or maybe one of your juiciest addictions these days. The third story is about listening to the body. And this kind of builds on what Bessel van der Kolk was saying. How can we listen to our felt sense in order to get wisdom? And this lesson came from Elizabeth Kristoff. And she had a really interesting story. Elizabeth was a serial entrepreneur in the health and wellness space. She had a very successful Pilates company. And due to all sorts of different circumstances, she lost the business. And so that was her kind of pause moment. And she started becoming more self-aware and reflecting on the last 5 years of what went wrong when I lost this business. And she started realizing that over the last 4 or 5 years, she was working nonstop and pushing herself over her physical boundaries. Like, she was exhausted to the point of not being able to think clearly. She had like brain fog. She was always tired, but she kept pushing. And the ironic thing is that Elizabeth Kristoff was super into wellness and being connected with your body. She had a Pilates studio. And she was like, how is this possible? That I really feel that it's super important to be connected to the body, and yet I feel that I'm disconnected or dissociated from my body. So she asked that distress, what's going on here? What's underneath the surface of my physical tiredness, of almost being at the point of being burned out? And what came up was this belief that her identity and her value as a human being had everything to do with the success of her business. Who in this audience owns or has done their own venture before? Yes, all right, entrepreneur. Yeah, I can really relate to that feeling, and I didn't think this would happen, but there's so much passion in what we do, especially those of us who go out and take the risk to build our own business. But what happened for Elizabeth, and also what happened for me, is that our identities got wrapped up in the business. So basically she felt like if her business wasn't doing well, then she was a failure, or she had no value in life. And she wasn't saying this to herself on a daily basis, like consciously. This was something that was happening unconsciously. So her distress allowed her to discover, whoa, okay, I can actually listen to the wisdom in my body and understand what my body is trying to say around a belief that I didn't even know that I had about my value as a human being attached to my business. So once she got that, she was able to let it go and decided to start a whole new business coming from a completely different perspective. So she was much more compassionate to herself. And on a similar note, economist Kate Raworth, the author of Donut Economics, maybe some of you are familiar with her, she says, we have an economy that needs to grow, whether or not it makes us thrive. What we need is an economy that makes us thrive, whether or not it grows. Right? So what's so interesting about Elizabeth's story and how it connects with Kate's is that on an individual level, Elizabeth was realizing something is not right here, and the way that I'm going about growing my business doesn't work. Kate Raworth is discovering the same thing that's happening on a macro level, right? There's also research being done that we're living in this capitalistic system that has an engine that needs to grow in order to just keep homeostasis. And so how can we challenge those beliefs that are underneath what's happening on the surface? The final story is about listening for metaphor. And that's coming back actually to my story. I finally decided, all right, I'm gonna investigate this distress, what's going on underneath the surface. And one of the things that was happening when I was in my depression as a teenager was I had a very strong inner critic. It was like my inner critic volume went like up to an 11, if you will. And one of the things that my inner critic kept saying was, everybody's fake, you're fake, everybody's fake. Like, it's not worth it to connect with anyone in high school because everyone's fake and you're not gonna get to know anyone, all of this stuff, right? So when I was in my depression, I was really taking that voice literally. I was thinking, oh my gosh, okay, everybody's fake, I'm not gonna connect with anyone. Of course, it made things worse because then I felt disconnected, I felt alone. But then I started listening, okay, what if I open up this idea that my inner critic may not be literally telling me something, but there is some truth in this? What's the metaphor? What's the symbol that's behind this? And later on, I learned a little bit about projecting, the psychological term of what we believe inside ourselves, we see everywhere in everyone else. So I started to notice and change that belief around to say, okay, if I have an inner critic that's saying everybody's fake, what if it's the wisdom is that I'm trying to give myself a signal that I'm being really fake, that I'm losing my authentic self in order to please people in high school, in order to be cool, and I was definitely one of those kids, I really wanted to be cool. But I lost my authenticity there, and it's something that's super important for all of us human beings, being authentic, being able to be connected with people in our authentic self. But for me, it was especially important. And once I made this realization that my inner critic of saying everyone was fake actually was a signal that I really needed to be more authentic and show more of my true self, then I started also becoming more open with people about not just the shiny sides and what I thought was cool and fun, but also connecting around what I was insecure about or that I didn't want to come to Brainwash Festival because maybe it's a bit scary. So, yeah. So, it's important to listen for metaphor. And on this note, we have another really interesting researcher, author, Russell Razak. He is a psychiatrist and spent most of his career working with people who are in the more acute phases of mental health distress. So people who are experiencing psychosis and other experiences. And what Russell discovered was that he was initially looking at the surface of these experiences and looking at, for example, symptoms of what people were saying in their states of psychosis. But then he started to listen for metaphor. Okay, so these things that one of his patients are saying, it's not necessarily like, it literally, for example, if someone was to say, yeah, I think everybody is a god, right? Russell started to listen to the metaphor in these stories, and he realized that there's actually a lot of wisdom if we don't take the messages seriously. If we take them seriously, but we don't necessarily take them literally. So that's something that he was discovering, and he noticed that the patients that he was caring for in these psychiatric wards had similar insights to what he was studying in his spirituality courses, if he just didn't take them so literally. So this is another advice to all of you, is about when you listen to your distress, you may not want to identify with it or believe exactly what it's saying, but almost like a caring or a curious friend, ask yourself, what is going on, and what could that mean if we look at it? And a lot of the work that I do also as a coach now is looking at symbol, looking at image to understand our distress. So that brings us to listening with empathy. If we listen with empathy, that we can start to understand that if we understand that our own distress is a sea of possibility underneath an iceberg, we can also notice that when other people are distressed and we have that initial reaction of like, whoa, what's going on? I can't relate to this person. Maybe there's something underneath the surface. So keep that in mind as well. There's many other stories from the podcast. I had the pleasure of interviewing 22 people in the podcast from all over the world, from Egypt, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Sweden, with all sorts of different distress experiences. And I just wanted to let you know, when we get the wisdom in our distress, what's possible. So out of these 22 interviews, this is what happened for people. 7 people had lifestyle changes as a result of discovering the wisdom in their distress. 13 people had deeper connections with others. 12 people had a shift in their leadership style. 13 took on new careers and opened new businesses. 11 out of the 22 dedicated themselves to a new type of activism. And 10 dedicated themselves to shifting the culture within their organization. So a lot of really cool world-changing wisdom happens from investigating the wisdom in our distress. So there's 32 episodes online. You can find it on Spotify. It's like my little plug for the podcast. If you want to know more of these stories, there's all sorts of really cool wisdom on here. And it leads us also to the final insight, which is that what's happening within us on an individual level is also reflecting what's happening in the world. And this insight comes also from Myrna Lewis. Is anyone familiar with the deep democracy dialogue method? Hands? Oh my gosh, yes! I'm really passionate about deep democracy, but Myrna Lewis is the founder of the Lewis method of deep democracy, and she talks about this idea that's fractal patterns, that it's a concept that comes from, help me out here, quantum physics, yes. It's a concept that comes from quantum physics, and it's this idea that what's happening in the bigger picture is something that's reflected on the smaller level. You can see this sometimes with broccoli and in nature and things like this. But this is also what's happening with our distress. So what's happening on a macro level with our cultural or all of these, the VUCA world that Thais also talked about, is also something that's happening within us. And when we investigate the distress that's happening to us, it can reflect what's going on the bigger level. So I want to leave you guys with two thoughts. The first is to ask yourself what your world would look like if there was a fundamental belief that there was wisdom in our distress. So what would your family system look like? What would your friends look like? What would your schools look like? What would our hospitals look like if we had this fundamental belief that there was wisdom in our distress? What would our world look like? So maybe that's a good conversation starter for your neighbors after this talk. And I'm giving you guys all sorts of food for your following up conversation. I'm really curious myself about what our mental health systems would look like if we started to really fundamentally believe that there was wisdom in our distress. And I'm going into a project with all sorts of cool people from various different sides of mental health to ask that question. How could we design a mental health system that would appreciate and be curious and interested in what's happening underneath the surface? So if you're interested in learning more about that project, please grab me after this talk. But that's the first thing. And the second thing I'd like you to think about, just to end this talk, is whenever you're having that feeling, like that inner struggle of, am I actually picking up on something? Or am I just crazy? Just picture me on the other side of the TV saying, you're not crazy, you're picking up on something, believe in your wisdom. Thank you so much.